My name is Katie Duncan. I am 32 years old. Just last weekend, I sat at my own wedding reception wearing a custom silk gown and watched my younger sister tap a silver spoon against her champagne flute. She smiled at a room of 150 guests, looked me dead in the eyes, and told me to drink up because my biggest surprise was coming. She thought I was drinking the heavy narcotic she had slipped into my glass when I was looking away. She expected me to pass out on the dance floor so she could drag me into a back room and steal my inheritance. What she did not know was that I had seen her do it. I had swapped our glasses, and the man she had been mocking all evening as a dirt-poor farmhand was about to lock the doors and legally seize every single asset she and her fiancé claimed to own. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my family's entire existence, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories where toxic relatives finally get exactly what they deserve, hit the like button and subscribe to Emily Told Stories. To understand how my own flesh and blood ended up holding a spiked drink at my wedding, you have to rewind 48 hours to our rehearsal dinner in Bismarck, North Dakota. The restaurant smelled of charred steak and spilled bourbon. I work as a senior forensic agribusiness accountant. My days are spent tracing supply chain discrepancies across the Great Plains. I look at numbers, identify anomalies, and locate missing funds. My fiancé, Ethan Cole, sat beside me in a faded flannel shirt, his hands rough from what my family assumed were long days walking crop lines. To my parents, Gary and Diane, Ethan was just a modest consultant scraping by on an hourly wage. They despised him for it. They had no idea Ethan was actually the founder and majority shareholder of Cole Energy and Logistics, an apex predator conglomerate controlling a vast portion of the Bakken oil fields. True power does not need to wear a suit. Across the table sat my younger sister Ashley and her fiancé Trevor. Trevor drove a lifted truck financed at a predatory interest rate and talked endlessly about his agricultural tech startup. He spent the entire dinner checking his oversized gold watch, a nervous habit belonging to a man drowning in leveraged debt. My father, Gary, viewed me strictly as a financial safety net. He leaned across the table, interrupting Ethan mid-sentence. "Katie," Gary said, tapping his fork against his porcelain plate. "We need to finalize the paperwork for those 500 acres in the Badlands tomorrow morning, before you walk down the aisle. Trevor needs the mineral rights as collateral for his new equipment fleet. The land was left to me by my late grandfather. He specifically bypassed my father, knowing Gary would bleed the soil dry to fund his fragile ego." I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cold glass steady my pulse. "That land is not a wedding favor, Gary. It stays in my name." Ashley scoffed, rolling her eyes so hard she nearly spilled her drink. "Do not be so greedy, Katie. It is just sitting there doing nothing. Trevor actually knows how to multiply capital. You are marrying a guy whose boots are held together by duct tape." She pointed a manicured finger at Ethan's footwear. "You cannot even afford a decent honeymoon, but you want to hoard grandfather's land? It is pathetic." Ethan did not flinch. He just offered a polite, quiet smile cutting into his steak. I remained perfectly silent, analyzing the frantic desperation hiding behind Trevor's forced grin. If I yielded, I would lose my grandfather's legacy to a con artist. The tension hung thick over the table. My mother, Diane, sighed loudly, glaring at me. "One bad ingredient ruins the whole party," she muttered, stabbing a piece of lettuce. They thought I was just a quiet, stubborn accountant. They thought they could bully me into submission before I put on a white dress. They had no idea they were poking a sleeping bear. The morning sun broke across the North Dakota plains, casting long, pale shadows over the frosted prairie grass. Inside the converted barn venue, the bridal suite smelled of aerosol hairspray and expensive lilies. I sat perfectly still before a sprawling lighted vanity, watching my own reflection. I wore a custom silk gown that draped flawlessly over my shoulders, yet my eyes remained the exact same calculating, unyielding lenses I used to scrutinize supply chain ledgers every single day. My makeup artist brushed a final layer of translucent powder across my cheekbones, humming a cheerful melody that felt entirely out of place against the creeping tension in my chest. The heavy oak door swung inward with a prolonged, echoing creak. My father, Gary, stepped over the threshold, his shoulders stiff beneath a dark, tailored suit. My mother, Diane, followed closely behind him, clutching a silver clutch purse. Their faces held no warmth, offering no trace of the parental joy expected on a wedding morning. They wore the rigid, calculating expressions of executives entering a hostile boardroom. Gary dismissed the makeup artist with a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. The young woman hesitated, glanced at my calm reflection, then quickly gathered her brushes and hurried out into the corridor. She pulled the door shut behind her. The brass lock engaged with a definitive, isolating click. My parents moved closer, boxing me into the corner of the room. Gary reached inside his tailored jacket and withdrew a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the illuminated glass surface of the vanity. The heavy paper slapped against the table, the sound cutting through the quiet room like a cracking whip. "I need your signature on these forms before you walk down the aisle." Katie Gary stated his tone, carrying a demanding, unwavering expectation of obedience. "It is a simple formality. Trevor is expanding his agricultural operations, and he needs to secure a new commercial credit line today. We decided the Badlands acreage will serve as the perfect wedding gift for your sister." I did not flinch. I kept my gaze locked on my own reflection for a long moment before slowly lowering my eyes to the folder. My late grandfather had spent his entire life working the unforgiving Midwestern soil, cultivating a pragmatic grit that Gary never managed to inherit. Grandfather understood the true, enduring value of unmined earth. He bypassed my father entirely in his will, entrusting the 500 acres of prime, oil-rich land exclusively to me. He knew Gary treated farming like a high-stakes casino gambling crop yields on foolish investments. I reached out and unclasped the folder. My manicured fingers brushed the crisp, watermarked parchment. It was a formal quitclaim deed, drafted by an expensive local attorney, designed to transfer the mineral rights and property title away from my name and directly into Trevor's newly formed LLC. I read the clauses rapidly, noting the expedited filing requests and the explicit waiver of financial consideration. My forensic training took over immediately. I did not see family members standing behind me. I saw a coordinated acquisition attempt aimed directly at my greatest asset. I closed the folder, pushing it back across the glass surface. "I am not signing away grandfather's legacy," I said, keeping my voice incredibly even. Gary's jaw tightened, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "You are being stubborn and unreasonable," he barked, planting his hands firmly on the back of my chair. "Trevor has a brilliant business model. His startup is poised to dominate the regional market, but he requires collateral to finalize his expansion. You are sitting on unutilized land while your sister is trying to build a future." I stood up slowly, letting the heavy silk of my gown settle around my heels. I turned to face them, projecting the cold, analytical authority I utilized to break fraudulent supply chain managers. "Trevor does not possess a brilliant business model," I countered, staring directly into Gary's furious eyes. "Your future son-in-law currently holds a staggering debt-to-equity ratio. Over the past 6 months, he financed a fleet of commercial vehicles and a luxury office lease using high-yield mezzanine loans. He cannot service those monthly payments because his agricultural startup has generated zero verifiable revenue. His primary lender is preparing to initiate asset seizure proceedings. He does not desire a wedding favor. He requires an emergency bailout to prevent total insolvency. Diane stepped forward, her expensive floral perfume clashing sharply with the tension in the room. Her eyes narrowed into venomous slits. "You always do this, Katie," she hissed, her voice dripping with spiteful indignation. "You sit in your sterile high-rise office looking down on everyone else. You spent your entire 20s buried in audit files, hoarding your paycheck, while Ashley actually lived her life. You are a cold, ungrateful spinster at heart." She pointed a shaking finger at my white dress. "You should be thanking heaven that a simple farmhand like Ethan even wanted to marry you. You are lucky anyone is willing to tolerate your endless calculations. Ashley deserves the affluent lifestyle she was meant for, and you owe this family your cooperation. Sign the paper." The insults bounced off my psychological armor, failing to penetrate the clinical detachment I had cultivated over decades of their emotional extortion. Diane wanted me to break. She expected me to burst into tears, to crave her maternal validation so desperately that I would trade my inheritance for a single word of praise. They viewed my silence as weakness, failing to recognize it as an impenetrable fortress. "I do not owe this family my financial security," I replied, my tone dropping to a chilling, authoritative register. "I will not subsidize Trevor's fraudulent debts, and I will not allow Gary's greed to consume grandfather's land. The deed stays in my name. This conversation is unequivocally over." I gathered the front of my heavy silk skirt, sidestepping my father's imposing figure. Diane tried to block my path, but I leveled a gaze so fierce and uncompromising that she instinctively stepped backward. I reached the oak door, twisted the brass lock, and walked out into the busy corridor, leaving them caged in their own failure. Back inside the bridal suite, a suffocating silence settled over Gary and Diane. The adjoining door leading to the private sitting room clicked open with a soft, ominous creak. Trevor and Ashley stepped out from the shadows. They had been standing there the entire time, listening through the thin drywall. Trevor ran a trembling hand through his meticulously styled hair, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. The oversized gold watch on his wrist caught the vanity light ticking rhythmically, counting down the hours until his creditors arrived. He looked at Ashley, his eyes hardening with a desperate, premeditated cruelty. "She rejected the transfer," Trevor whispered, his voice shaking with panic and rising fury. "The bank is going to call the loans on Monday morning. If we do not secure those mineral rights today, I am going to lose everything." Ashley stood motionless, her manicured nails digging deep into the palms of her hands. Her flawless, arrogant facade cracked, revealing the toxic entitlement festering underneath. She stared at the closed oak door where her sister had just exited. "Then we do not give her a choice," Ashley replied, her voice cold and hollow. Trevor reached into his tailored suit pocket, his fingers wrapping around a small, concealed item. He pulled it out, keeping it hidden in the palm of his hand. He shared a dark, calculating look with his fiancée. The boundary of emotional manipulation had just been permanently crossed. They realized words and intimidation would never break the forensic accountant. They needed a method that bypassed her conscious refusal entirely. "Get the notary on standby," Trevor instructed quietly, his gaze locked on the quitclaim deed still resting on the vanity glass. "We initiate Plan B during the toasts." The bridal suite fell silent once more, harboring a sinister promise. The family had officially transitioned from desperate greed to physical malice, laying the groundwork for a felony assault that would soon test the limits of blood loyalty on the open plains. The converted timber barn hummed with the collective energy of 150 invited guests. Golden Edison bulbs strung along the vaulted rafters cast a warm amber glow over the rustic luxury tables draped in white linen and scattered with native wildflowers. The air was thick with the rich scent of roasted prime rib, sweet butter, and expensive floral arrangements. Outside, the North Dakota twilight surrendered to a deep, starless indigo sky. But inside, the celebration of our marriage was purportedly reaching its peak. I sat at the head table beside Ethan, my fingers resting lightly on the white tablecloth. My husband wore his tailored dark suit with an easy, unassuming grace, yet every line of his posture radiated a quiet, protective strength. Across the room, the heavy oak bar served as the social hub for the evening, surrounded by laughing relatives and cascading tiers of champagne towers. My gaze drifted upward, latching onto a large, ornate, gilded mirror mounted on the timber wall behind the bar. The antique glass provided a wide, unobstructed angle of reflection, capturing movements that would otherwise remain hidden from direct view. Through that silvered glass, I spotted my sister. Ashley stood partially concealed behind a towering pillar of crystal flutes. Her expression carried an intensity that belonged in a boardroom rather than a wedding reception. Her hands moved with a quick, practiced stealth. I watched as she reached into the small beaded clutch dangling from her wrist, extracting a tiny folded square of foil. With a swift flick of her thumb, she tore the packet open. A fine white crystalline powder drifted downward, disappearing into the pale effervescence of a flute stationed near the front of the tray. Two identical glasses stood side by side, yet her fingers lingered only over the one closest to the edge, the glass designated for the bride. My forensic training kicked in instantly, stripping away any lingering familial denial. My mind processed the action not as a sibling prank, but as a compromised financial and biological asset. The chemical substance dissolving in that liquid was designed for rapid systemic absorption. The objective was clear and calculated. They intended to render me unconscious under the guise of wedding fatigue, carry my limp body to the bridal suite during the chaos of the reception, and press a pen into an unresponsive hand to execute the quitclaim deed. The last, fragile thread of sisterly affection snapped, dissolving into a cold, profound void. The internal conflict that had plagued me for years vanished in a single heartbeat. There was no grief left inside my chest, only the pristine clarity of a forensic accountant identifying a fatal ledger error. They had crossed the threshold from emotional extortion into felony drugging. I did not gasp. I did not stand up and scream across the room. My heart rate remained steady, controlled by the icy discipline I utilized when uncovering multi-million-dollar supply chain fraud. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game of chemical coercion, I intended to let the mathematics balance themselves out. The barn photographer suddenly stepped onto the riser near our table, raising his professional camera and shouting for the bridal party to gather for an impromptu group photo. The sudden diversion drew the attention of the surrounding crowd. Conversations paused, and guests began shifting their chairs, creating a momentary wave of motion and noise. Ashley hastily shoved the empty foil packet back into her clutch, grabbed the tray containing the two champagne flutes, and turned away from the bar to make her way toward our table. Her face was locked into a tight, rehearsed smile of sisterly devotion. I moved with the silent, fluid precision of a predator closing in on its target. Under the cover of the shifting crowd, I slid my hand across the white linen tablecloth. My fingers brushed the stem of my clean, untouched water glass before gliding smoothly toward Ashley as she approached. With a flick of my wrist, so subtle it registered as a natural adjustment of silverware, I exchanged my empty flute with the identical glass resting on the front edge of her tray. The swap was complete before a single witness could blink. Ashley reached the head table, her eyes bright with a manic, triumphant gleam. She set the newly switched glass down precisely beside my plate, her movements slightly hurried. She then picked up the second glass from the tray, holding it aloft with a dramatic flourish. Right on cue, the wedding DJ lowered the background music, signaling the start of the traditional dances. Ethan stood up, offering his hand to me. I placed my palm in his, letting him pull me toward the center of the polished hardwood dance floor. As we swayed to the slow rhythmic cadence of a country ballad, I chose to deploy a strategic red herring. I allowed my body to slacken slightly, leaning my weight against Ethan's broad shoulder. I let out a soft, staged sigh, mimicking the initial physiological onset of dizziness. From the edge of the dance floor, Ashley and Trevor watched our movements like hawks. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their bodies tense with anticipation. When Ashley saw me lean against Ethan, her posture shifted instantly. The nervous tension on her face melted into an expression of arrogant, unadulterated relief. She nudged Trevor in the ribs, pointing toward us with a sharp, victorious nod. Trevor mirrored her grin, his chest puffing out with the hollow pride of a man who believed he had successfully executed a flawless corporate takeover. They firmly believed their narcotic trap was working with absolute precision. They were waiting for the chemical agent to drag me down, entirely unaware of the biological timeline ticking away in their own hands. The biological clock was ruthless. Every second that passed brought the unsuspecting target closer to the systemic collapse they had engineered for me. The mounting dread did not belong to the bride on the dance floor. It belonged to the woman holding the poisoned chalice at the edge of the room. The music swelled, filling the timber barn with rich acoustic notes, while the trap quietly closed around the architects of my ruin. The final notes of the acoustic guitar faded into the high timber rafters of the converted barn. Ethan guided me back to our seats at the head table, his hand resting with a gentle grounding pressure on the small of my back. The temperature in the room had steadily risen, warmed by the body heat of 150 guests and the glowing amber filaments of the overhead bulbs. Caterers moved with practiced stealth along the perimeter of the room, pouring fresh wine and clearing porcelain appetizer plates. Our arrival at the sweetheart table served as the unspoken cue for the evening's formalities to resume. I sat down, smoothing the heavy layers of silk over my knees. The crystal flute rested exactly where I had placed it, harboring the clear, untainted champagne. Across the room, my younger sister broke away from Trevor. She smoothed the front of her sequin dress and strode purposefully toward the front of the room. Ashley held the microphone in her left hand and a cheap rented champagne flute in her right. The glass was fragile, thin-rimmed, and prone to shattering under the slightest pressure. It served as a perfect physical representation of the hollow facade she and Trevor had constructed. My power, by stark contrast, resided in the unbreakable, unyielding soil of the North Dakota Badlands. 500 acres of ancient earth layered with rich mineral deposits that could never be cracked, forged, or stolen through chemical parlor tricks. Ashley stopped adjacent to our table, her stiletto heels sinking slightly into the rustic hardwood floor. She tapped a silver spoon against the rim of her glass. The sharp, resonant chime cut through the ambient chatter. The crowd quieted, shifting their chairs to face the front. Gary and Diane sat at the primary family table directly in the front row, their faces radiating a deep, unearned pride. They beamed at their golden child, entirely ignorant of the legal guillotine hovering over their own necks. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my big sister Ashley," began her voice echoing through the amplified speakers. She offered a bright, practiced smile to the crowd. Her tone was saturated with a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the sharp, jagged edges of her resentment. Growing up, Katie was always the serious one. While the rest of us were out experiencing the world, building networks, and making memories, Katie was usually locked in her bedroom with a calculator. She paused, letting a scattering of polite, uncertain laughter ripple through the audience. We honestly worried she might just marry a spreadsheet. After all, when your entire life revolves around auditing supply chain ledgers and counting other people's pennies, there is not much room left for romance. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, observing the subtle tightening of my father's jaw. Gary nodded along, validating the public degradation of my career. He viewed my forensic expertise as a tedious flaw, failing to realize those same analytical skills had already mapped out his impending financial ruin. Ashley took a deliberate step closer to our table, turning her painted smile toward my husband. And then, against all odds, she found Ethan. Ashley continued, her voice dripping with a calculated, sugary condescension. Ethan, you are such a trooper. We all know crop consulting is back-breaking, modest work. It takes a special kind of simple farm boy to look at my sister's rigid, boring routine and say, yes, I want to wake up to that every single morning. The crowd shifted uncomfortably in their wooden chairs. A few of the wealthy agricultural executives seated in the back rows exchanged bewildered glances, recognizing the profound insult woven into her seemingly cheerful delivery. Trevor, however, stood near the rustic oak bar, grinning widely, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. He rubbed the face of his flashy gold watch, believing he was watching the ultimate subjugation of his primary obstacles. Ethan did not react to the public humiliation. He leaned back in his chair, his broad shoulders relaxed, his dark eyes fixed on Ashley with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a highly predictable insect. He understood the dramatic irony playing out before us. The local farmers and rural elite were chuckling at a man they thought lived paycheck to paycheck, unaware they were laughing at the primary shareholder of the largest energy conglomerate in the state. Ashley raised her glass higher, ensuring every eye in the barn was focused squarely on the two of us. She looked directly into my eyes. The facade of the loving sister vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a fierce, predatory hunger. She was eager for the sedative to take hold. She was desperate for the ink on that forged quitclaim deed. "Here is to Katie and Ethan," Ashley declared, her voice projecting loud and clear over the silent room. "May your future be as predictable as your past! Drink up, Katie. Your biggest surprise is coming." She tilted her head back and drained a significant portion of her champagne. I mirrored her motion with measured grace. I lifted my own flute, bringing the cool crystal to my lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the clean, untainted liquid. I swallowed, lowering the glass back to the white linen tablecloth. Ashley's eyes locked onto mine, searching for the initial telltale signs of chemical sluggishness. I offered her a serene, unblinking smile. She turned away, handing the microphone back to the DJ, her posture radiating arrogant victory as she began walking back toward Trevor. The trap was formally sprung, but the snare was tightening around her own ankles. I leaned closer to my husband. The faint scent of cedar and clean cotton grounded me in the chaotic room. The time for passive observation had ended. "The forgery plot is active," I whispered, keeping my voice low enough that only he could hear the syllables over the returning swell of the background music. She spiked the drink. I swapped the glasses. A silent, rehearsed look passed between us. Ethan's relaxed, easygoing demeanor evaporated in an instant. The illusion of the simple crop consultant shed like a discarded skin, revealing the cold, terrifying precision of a chief executive officer. He did not pull out a laptop. He did not frantically hack into any mainframes or panic over the physical threat to his wife. We had anticipated Trevor's desperation weeks ago. During my initial forensic audit of Trevor's failing agricultural tech startup, Ethan's corporate intelligence division had quietly mirrored Trevor's digital footprint. They had already intercepted the encrypted emails detailing the shadow notary, the forged signatures, and the timeline for the coerced land transfer. The evidence was already secured, categorized, and waiting on a secure server in a towering glass building in downtown Bismarck. Ethan reached into the interior pocket of his dark suit jacket and withdrew a sleek, encrypted smartphone. He unlocked the screen with a quick biometric scan. He did not draft a lengthy email or make an anxious phone call. The vast infrastructure for Trevor's destruction was already meticulously laid out, requiring only the final authorization to commence the demolition. Ethan opened a secure messaging channel linked directly to his senior legal counsel and his chief operating officer. His thumb hovered over the digital keyboard for a single heartbeat. He typed a single, definitive word. Execute. He pressed send, placing the phone face down on the table. The digital command shot through the cellular network, initiating a ruthless cascade of asset seizures, corporate margin calls, and dispatched law enforcement protocols across the county. The trap was officially armed. Across the room, Ashley wrapped her arms around Trevor's neck, laughing brightly at a joke he whispered in her ear. Her pupils were likely already beginning to dilate as the narcotic breached her bloodstream. They stood firmly on the precipice of their own ruin, entirely unaware that the floorboards beneath their feet had just been pulled wide open. The synthetic sedative did not announce itself with a gentle wave of fatigue. It struck my sister's nervous system with the undeniable force of a runaway freight train. One moment, Ashley was spinning under the amber glow of the Edison bulbs, her laughter ringing sharp and triumphant over the rhythmic thrum of the bass guitar. The next moment, the intricate coordination required to maintain her posture simply ceased to exist. Her knees buckled beneath the heavy layers of her sequin dress. She reached out her manicured fingers, clawing blindly at the empty air, before snagging the lapel of Trevor's tailored jacket. Trevor caught her staggering backward under the sudden, unexpected dead weight. At first, a few guests standing nearby offered polite, sympathetic chuckles, assuming the bride's younger sister had consumed one too many glasses of vintage champagne. But the reality of her physiological collapse quickly shattered that comfortable illusion. Ashley's head lolled backward, exposing the pale column of her throat. Her eyes rolled deep into their sockets, leaving only crescent moons of white visible beneath her fluttering eyelashes. A thick, guttural string of slurred syllables spilled from her lips, entirely incoherent and terrifyingly raw. The affluent crowd, a mixture of wealthy agribusiness owners and regional oil executives, instinctively recoiled. The joyful perimeter of the dance floor fractured as people scrambled away from the collapsing couple. A woman in a navy evening gown gasped, dropping her silk clutch to the floor. Whispers ignited like dry kindling catching a spark. The veneer of a perfect high society country wedding fractured into 1,000 irreparable shards. Any normal, innocent fiancé witnessing his partner suffer a sudden neurological event would immediately scream for a doctor. He would lay her flat on her back, check her pulse, and beg someone to call emergency services. Trevor did none of those things. His reaction bypassed basic human empathy and went straight into feral, debt-fueled preservation. Thick beads of perspiration erupted across his forehead, gleaming under the venue lights. His pupils dilated with sheer, unadulterated panic. Instead of lowering Ashley to the safety of the hardwood floor, he hooked his arms under her armpits and began hoisting her limp, unresponsive body upward. He gritted his teeth, his expensive leather shoes slipping against the polished oak as he desperately attempted to drag her dead weight toward the dark corridor leading to the private bridal suite. Her heels dragged uselessly behind her, leaving long, scuffing trails on the pristine wood. His breathing grew jagged and frantic. He craned his neck, searching the perimeter of the horrified crowd, until his wild gaze locked onto my father. "Get the paperwork!" Trevor bellowed, his voice cracking with a terrifying, irrational urgency. "Gary, grab the folder and bring it to the room right now. We have to finish this." The demand echoed over the fading chords of the wedding band. It was a bizarre, profoundly incriminating command that left the surrounding guests exchanging bewildered, alarmed stares. Why would a man holding his comatose partner demand legal documents instead of an ambulance. I remained seated at the head table for one additional second, processing the glorious, self-inflicted destruction of his alibi. He was so consumed by the impending foreclosure of his fake agricultural startup that he could not recognize his own public unraveling. I rose from my chair, the heavy silk of my custom gown whispering against the floorboards. I did not rush. I moved with the measured, predatory grace of a forensic auditor walking into a hostile boardroom. I locked eyes with the young DJ standing on the elevated riser to my left. I raised my hand and drew a single, flat line across my throat. The young man blinked in surprise, then instantly slammed his hand down on the mixing board console. The music died on the spot. The sudden absence of sound fell over the sprawling timber barn like a suffocating wool blanket. The cheerful ambient energy of the reception was eradicated. The only noises remaining in the cavernous room were the ragged, desperate gasps of Trevor, dragging my sister across the floor, and the steady, authoritative click of my heels as I stepped down from the bridal platform. I stopped in the exact center of the room, positioning myself squarely between Trevor and the hallway to the bridal suite. I projected my voice, keeping my tone crisp, icy, and devoid of any sisterly warmth. "Do not bring him that folder, Gary," I announced, the syllables cutting through the dead air with lethal precision. Every head in the room snapped toward me. The rural elite, the wealthy investors, and our extended relatives stared in breathless anticipation. I turned my gaze across the audience, addressing them with the sterile, factual delivery of a sworn testimony. "My sister is not suffering from dehydration," I stated clearly, ensuring my voice reached the farthest corners of the barn. "She has not consumed too much alcohol. She is currently experiencing the severe neurological shutdown associated with a heavy, fast-acting synthetic narcotic. It is a chemical sedative she intentionally slipped into my champagne glass just 15 minutes ago, fully intending to incapacitate me." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. Hands flew to cover open mouths. The local farmers and oil tycoons, men and women who valued honest labor and straightforward dealings, stared at the limp, drooling form of my sister with profound revulsion. The carefully curated social standing my parents had spent decades cultivating in Bismarck evaporated into the cold night air. The truth struck my father like a physical blow. But instead of turning his anger toward the man dragging his unconscious daughter, his deeply ingrained toxicity pivoted instantly toward the truth-teller. Gary's face flushed a dangerous mottled crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched white collar. He lunged forward, closing the distance between the family table and my position with alarming speed. "You hysterical liar," Gary spat, his voice trembling with a fierce, unchecked rage. He reached out his large, calloused hand, clamping down hard on my bare forearm. His thick fingers dug into my skin, attempting to utilize the same physical intimidation he had wielded throughout my entire childhood to force my submission. "Shut your mouth right now before you ruin this entire family. You are making a fool of yourself." He expected me to shrink back. He expected me to lower my head and apologize. He failed to account for the man standing mere inches behind me. Ethan intercepted the assault with terrifying fluid efficiency. The facade of the unassuming crop consultant dissolved into thin air. Ethan stepped into my father's personal space, his broad shoulders shielding me from the attack. He did not raise his voice. He did not throw a punch. He simply reached out and gripped Gary's wrist with a crushing, inescapable leverage. With a single practiced motion, Ethan twisted the joint precisely against its natural axis. Gary let out a sharp, breathless yelp of pain, his fingers springing open instantly. Ethan shoved the older man backward. Gary stumbled clumsily, his dress shoes catching on the hem of a tablecloth, nearly sending him crashing into the front row of guests. He clutched his throbbing wrist, staring at my husband with wide, terrified eyes, finally recognizing that he had just attempted to assault the wife of an apex predator. Ethan did not spare my father another glance. The atmosphere surrounding him had shifted irrevocably. He radiated a cold, undeniable corporate dominance that demanded unequivocal submission from every person in the room. He smoothed the lapels of his dark suit, walked calmly past the trembling patriarch of my family, and approached the DJ's elevated stand. Ethan reached out and took the microphone from the stunned musician's hand. He turned around to face the silent, paralyzed crowd. The flannel-wearing farmhand was gone. In his place stood a multi-billion-dollar chief executive officer, holding the digital guillotine in his right hand, fully prepared to initiate the public execution of the people who had dared to target his bride. Ethan stood under the warm amber glow of the barn lighting, holding the black microphone with a steady, relaxed grip. The surrounding guests held their collective breath, sensing the profound shift in the atmosphere. He did not yell to command their attention. True authority never needs to raise its voice. He simply raised his free hand and signaled the audiovisual technician stationed in the loft above the dance floor. The large projector screens, which had spent the last 2 hours rotating through a cheerful, romantic slideshow of our engagement photos, suddenly flickered. The smiling images of our life together vanished in an instant. In their place, stark, white document files illuminated the dark timber room. The screens displayed high-resolution, heavily encrypted email threads. The text was magnified to an enormous scale, making the crisp black font visible to every single guest sitting in the back rows near the bar. The contrast was jarring. The beautiful, rustic wedding aesthetic now served as a backdrop for a digital crime scene. Ethan looked at the screen, then turned his dark, unblinking gaze to the man still clutching my unconscious sister. Trevor stood frozen in the center of the hardwood floor, his face draining to a sickly pale gray. His breathing turned shallow and rapid, his chest rising and falling beneath his expensive, tailored suit. These communications were intercepted from an unsecured server originating in Bismarck. Ethan announced, his voice smooth and resonant through the venue's speakers. They detail a proposed financial transaction between the owner of an agricultural equipment startup and an unlicensed third party offering illicit legal services. Let us review the specific terms of this contract. Ethan began reading the projected text aloud. His cadence was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of emotion. He detailed Trevor offering $10,000 in cash to a shadow notary. The emails explicitly outlined the plan to wait until the bride was heavily intoxicated, bring her to a private room, and have the notary stamp a forged signature on a quitclaim deed transferring 500 acres of Badlands mineral rights. Ethan read the exact dates, the routing numbers, and the crude, dismissive language Trevor used to describe me in the messages. The rural community guests murmured in deep, palpable shock. Local farmers and oil field executives value a person's word and the sanctity of land ownership above all else. Hearing a man plot to steal a generational inheritance through chemical coercion struck a primal nerve in the room. The polite smiles of the elite attendees morphed into expressions of raw disgust. Trevor dropped Ashley. Her limp body slid through his grasp. She slumped into a nearby wooden chair, her head resting awkwardly against the table edge, a thin line of saliva pooling at the corner of her mouth. Trevor ignored her condition entirely. He pointed a shaking finger at the projection screens above the dance floor. "Those are fake!" Trevor shouted, his voice cracking with a high, desperate panic that echoed off the high ceiling. "He hacked into my phone and typed those himself to frame me. You cannot prove anything based on a slideshow. I have a legitimate, state-certified official ready to witness the transfer. She is waiting in the bridal suite right now to verify everything I am saying. I stepped out from behind my husband, the heavy silk of my custom gown brushing softly against the floorboards. I walked toward Trevor, my posture radiating the clinical chill of a senior forensic accountant presenting a finalized audit to a board of directors. I did not show anger. I showed the terrifying calm of a woman who had already won the war before the battle even started. You do not have a state-certified official waiting in the bridal suite, Trevor. I stated my tone, carrying the sterile precision of a surgical blade. 2 weeks ago, while tracing the leveraged debt surrounding your failing equipment fleet, I noticed a very peculiar cash withdrawal from your primary business account. It was a withdrawal designated for expedited legal services, routed through an unverified generic vendor name. Trevor swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step backward. His eyes darted nervously between the projected emails and my face. The nervous tick returned to his wrist as he subconsciously adjusted his oversized gold watch. The ledger of a failing business always tells a story of desperation. I continued pacing slowly toward him. When I analyzed your accounts, I saw the frantic shifting of funds. Unpaid vendor invoices were piling up, while a sudden $10,000 wire transfer cleared to a blind shell company. It took my software less than 10 minutes to trace that company back to a known provider of illicit document services. Instead of blocking the transaction, I let it process. I intercepted your digital inquiry before you even confirmed the appointment. The silence in the barn deepened, thick and suffocating, wrapping around Trevor's throat like a physical restraint. I reached out to the provider, I explained, keeping my gaze locked on his terrified eyes. The woman sitting in the bridal suite right now, holding a fake notary stamp, is not a corrupt official willing to take your bribe. She is a licensed corporate investigator currently on my personal payroll. She has been documenting your communications for 14 days. Every text message, every phone call, and every email coordinating this felony has been federally time-stamped and logged on a secure server. At this exact moment, she is packing up her recording equipment and sealing the physical evidence into sterile bags. You did not hire a co-conspirator to steal my land. You funded your own surveillance. My mother, Diane, let out a sharp, breathless gasp from the front row. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes wide with horror. She tried to step forward to defend her golden child's chosen partner, but the undeniable weight of the projected evidence paralyzed her legs. The emails on the screen included Trevor's bank routing numbers, matching the exact accounts he used to boast about his fake wealth at the rehearsal dinner. Trevor stared at the glowing white screens. The crushing reality of his situation finally breached his arrogant delusion. He realized his digital footprint had been entirely weaponized against him. The trap was not just sprung. It was heavily fortified, paved with his own written words, and locked from the outside. The desperate animalistic instinct for self-preservation overrode his remaining logic. He did not try to argue further. He did not turn to check on his sedated fiancée. He only thought about the keys to his lifted luxury truck waiting in the parking lot. Trevor spun around on his expensive leather shoes and sprinted toward the rear of the barn. He pushed past a group of startled caterers, knocking a silver tray of crystal glasses to the floor. The shattering sound echoed sharply, sending shards of glass sliding across the polished wood, but Trevor did not slow down. He aimed for the towering, heavy timber doors that served as the primary exit to the venue parking lot. He slammed his shoulder into the thick wood, expecting the doors to swing open and grant him access to the open North Dakota plains and his escape vehicle. The doors did not budge. A loud, metallic rattling echoed as Trevor threw his entire body weight against the brass handles. He scrambled backward, gripping the iron latches and pulling with all his strength. The mechanisms held firm, unyielding against his frantic tugging. From the outside, the distinct, heavy clanking of thick steel chains and industrial padlocks shifting against the timber could be heard. Trevor peered through the narrow vertical glass panes set into the center of the doors, his breath fogging the glass. Standing shoulder to shoulder on the exterior patio were 4 men wearing dark tactical suits. They were not local police officers or hired venue staff. They were private security personnel quietly deployed by Ethan long before the reception began, tasked with securing the perimeter. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, their expressions blank and unflinching, staring back at Trevor through the glass panes. They did not move to open the door. They simply watched him panic. Trevor pressed his hands flat against the wooden panels, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He was caged. The sprawling, rustic luxury of the wedding venue had been transformed into a secure holding facility, isolating him from the outside world. He turned slowly back to face the crowd, his face slick with cold terror. He was trapped in a room with 150 witnesses, a forensic accountant holding his documented crimes, and a man holding the microphone, who was just beginning to reveal his true power. Trevor stood with his back pressed against the heavy timber doors. His chest heaved as his panicked gaze swept across the silent reception hall. The realization of his physical captivity crashed over him, but his arrogant nature refused to accept defeat. His ego, forged in a culture of leveraged debt and superficial optics, desperately sought a lifeline. He looked past the shocked faces of the local farmers and zeroed in on Ethan. In Trevor's distorted reality, the man holding the microphone was still just a modest crop consultant, a man who drove a dented pickup truck and wore flannel shirts, a man who could easily be crushed by the sheer weight of superior capital. Trevor pushed himself away from the locked doors. He straightened his tailored suit jacket and ran a trembling hand over his slick hair. He forced his shoulders back, attempting to project a hollow aura of financial superiority as he marched back toward the center of the dance floor. He stopped a few paces away from my husband, jutting his chin forward in a pathetic display of bravado. "You think you are so clever locking those doors," Trevor sneered, his voice dripping with forced condescension. "You think projecting some fake emails on a screen gives you power over me. You are just a dirt-poor farmhand playing a game you do not understand. My agricultural tech startup is backed by a staggeringly large commercial credit line. I have a team of corporate lawyers on retainer who specialize in burying insignificant pests like you. If you do not unlock those doors and let me walk out of here right now, I will sue you for false imprisonment and defamation. I will drag you and your precious bride into court until you are both drowning in legal fees and begging for bankruptcy." The profound, dramatic irony of his threat hung heavily in the air. The wealthy rural guests, many of whom possessed a sharp understanding of actual capital, watched the exchange in breathless silence. They recognized the distinct scent of a cornered animal making empty threats. Ethan did not flinch. He did not step back or raise his voice to match Trevor's rising hysteria. For a long moment, my husband simply looked at the sweating man standing before him. Then a low, chilling laugh escaped Ethan's throat. It was not a sound of amusement. It was the cold, sterile sound of a predator examining a remarkably foolish prey. The modest disguise Ethan had maintained for years began to shed entirely. He had spent his 20s building an empire in the unforgiving environment of the Bakken oil fields, turning strategic investments and relentless discipline into a formidable conglomerate. He chose to live quietly, driving an older vehicle and wearing practical clothing specifically to filter out the opportunistic parasites who gravitated toward visible wealth. Trevor was the exact breed of parasite Ethan had designed his life to avoid. "My name is not simply Ethan, the crop consultant," my husband announced, his voice smooth and resonant through the venue speakers. He maintained unblinking eye contact with Trevor. "I am Ethan Cole. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Cole Energy and Logistics." The name dropped into the silent barn like a heavy stone plunging into a still pond. A sudden, audible gasp rippled through the back rows of the audience. The regional oil tycoons and prominent agricultural executives sitting at the VIP tables stiffened in their chairs. They knew that name intimately. Cole Energy and Logistics was the apex predator of the Great Plains, a multi-billion-dollar entity that controlled vast supply chains and dictated market trends across the entire Midwest. The unassuming man standing by the DJ booth was not a blue-collar laborer. He was the undisputed king of their industry. Trevor's arrogant sneer faltered. His eyes widened, darting frantically around the room, reading the stunned, reverent expressions on the faces of the wealthiest guests. The horrifying truth began to seep through his stubborn denial. I stood a few paces behind Ethan, observing the flawless precision of his delivery. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice to demand respect. He wielded his authority with the calm, chilling efficiency of a natural force. The wealthy investors in the audience leaned forward, hanging on his every word, fully recognizing they were witnessing a masterclass in corporate dismantling. Trevor, meanwhile, was visibly shrinking. The expensive fabric of his suit suddenly looked like a borrowed costume that no longer fit. His frantic eyes darted toward the exit again, but the stoic private security personnel remained stationed by the padlocked timber doors, an unyielding reminder of his physical confinement. Ethan raised his hand and signaled the audiovisual technician in the loft. The glowing screens above the dance floor shifted instantly. The incriminating email threads vanished, replaced by a complex, high-resolution corporate hierarchy flowchart. The diagram displayed a vast network of holding companies, subsidiaries, and financial institutions, all branching downward from the primary Cole Energy and Logistics crest at the very top. Ethan pointed toward the lower left corner of the sprawling chart. There, highlighted in a bright, undeniable red box, was the specific name of the predatory lending firm that financed Trevor's flashy lifestyle. "You like to brag about your extensive commercial credit line," Ethan stated, his tone carrying the clinical precision of a surgeon dissecting a flawed specimen. "You rely on a specific holding company to lease your luxury trucks, fund your office space, and sustain the illusion of your success. What your lawyers failed to disclose during your last frantic phone call is that my conglomerate quietly acquired that exact holding company 30 days ago. I bought their entire portfolio of distressed debt at a steep discount." Trevor stopped breathing. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He stared at the red box on the screen, his mind struggling to process the catastrophic revelation. "I am not just the groom at this wedding," Ethan continued, delivering the words with ruthless clarity. "I am legally your supreme creditor. I own every single loan, lease, and line of credit attached to your name and your hollow startup." Trevor stumbled backward, his knees trembling under the crushing weight of his newly discovered reality. He looked down at the oversized gold watch on his wrist, suddenly realizing he did not own a single piece of the metal. "When a borrower engages in documented federal fraud to acquire assets," Ethan explained, addressing the room but keeping his lethal focus on Trevor, "the lending institution reserves the right to invoke protective measures. I have already forwarded the encrypted emails and the digital footprints of your forgery plot to our senior compliance officers. As the majority shareholder and acting chief executive, I formally exercised my executive authority 10 minutes ago." Ethan lowered the microphone slightly. "I triggered the acceleration clause on your $4 million debt. The entire principal balance is due immediately. Since you do not possess the liquid capital to satisfy that demand, my firm has officially frozen your accounts and initiated full asset seizure protocols. At this exact second, corporate liquidators are locking down your leased office and securing the titles to your vehicles. You are entirely bankrupt. The structural integrity of Trevor's legs finally failed him. His knees gave out, buckling beneath his tailored trousers. He collapsed heavily into a wooden chair adjacent to the sweetheart table. He landed directly next to my sister Ashley. She remained slumped in her seat, her head tilted awkwardly, a thin line of saliva tracking down her chin as the heavy sedative continued to suppress her nervous system. Trevor stared blankly at the hardwood floor, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged gasps. The flashy opportunist who had plotted to steal my inherited land was now a destitute criminal waiting for the authorities to arrive. The rural elite in the audience watched the financial execution with silent, unblinking fascination. They witnessed the ultimate penalty for confusing quiet humility with vulnerability. The room was perfectly still, devoid of any sympathy for the ruined man sweating in the chair. Yet the systemic eradication of the toxic infection was not yet complete. Trevor was merely a symptom of a much deeper, older rot. The true architects of this environment, the individuals who had actively nurtured Ashley's entitlement and enabled Trevor's greed, were sitting in the front row. I stepped forward, moving past my husband. The heavy silk of my gown rustled softly against the floorboards as I approached the edge of the elevated platform. I looked down at my parents. Gary and Diane sat frozen at the primary family table, their faces pale masks of sheer terror. They had just watched their golden child's future evaporate into thin air. They assumed the destruction would stop with Trevor. They were entirely wrong. The forensic audit I had conducted extended far beyond Trevor's fabricated ledgers, digging deep into the secret financial maneuvers my own parents had executed behind my back. It was time to show the entire room exactly how much Gary and Diane were willing to sacrifice to steal my legacy. The crushing weight of my husband's corporate authority had effectively paralyzed the man sitting slumped in the wooden chair. Trevor stared blankly at the polished hardwood floor, his breathing reduced to shallow, ragged gasps as the reality of his absolute bankruptcy settled over him. Ethan had surgically dismantled the facade of the wealthy agricultural tech entrepreneur, exposing the destitute criminal underneath. Yet the eradication of this toxic infection was not entirely complete. Trevor was merely the opportunistic parasite that had attached itself to a much deeper, older rot within my own family. The true architects of this environment, the individuals who had actively nurtured my sister's staggering entitlement and enabled this massive financial fraud, were sitting entirely frozen in the front row. I stepped forward, moving past Ethan with a slow, deliberate grace. The heavy silk of my custom wedding gown rustled softly against the floorboards as I approached the edge of the elevated bridal platform. The cavernous timber barn was completely silent, devoid of the cheerful ambient chatter that typically accompanies a wedding reception. 150 affluent guests, a mixture of pragmatic local farmers and wealthy regional oil executives, sat in breathless anticipation. I looked directly down at my parents. Gary and Diane sat rigidly at the primary family table, their faces pale masks of sheer, unadulterated terror. They had just watched their golden child's future evaporate into thin air. They incorrectly assumed the destruction would end with the man slouched in the chair next to my unconscious sister. They were entirely wrong. I raised my hand and signaled the audio-visual technician stationed in the loft above the dance floor. The glowing projector screens shifted instantly. The complex corporate hierarchy chart detailing Ethan's conglomerate vanished. In its place Stark white spreadsheets and highly detailed financial ledgers illuminated the dark room. My parents have always been remarkably eager to mock my profession, I announced, projecting my voice with a crisp, icy authority that echoed through the amplified speakers. They viewed my career as a tedious, boring flaw. They believed that spending a decade buried in supply chain ledgers and corporate audits made me naive to the real world. They fundamentally failed to understand that a senior forensic agribusiness accountant does not merely crunch numbers. I track phantom assets across the Great Plains. I identify structural vulnerabilities, and I specialize in hunting down executives who fabricate their wealth. I pressed a small wireless remote in my hand, advancing the slide on the massive screens. High-resolution photographs of heavy agricultural machinery appeared, positioned directly next to highlighted columns of vehicle identification numbers and corresponding loan origination documents. 3 months ago, I initiated a comprehensive covert forensic audit into Trevor's supposedly booming agricultural equipment startup, I explained, maintaining unblinking eye contact with my father. Trevor claimed to own a massive, highly profitable fleet of commercial tractors and specialized harvesting combines. He used the projected value of this imaginary fleet to secure massive amounts of high-yield mezzanine debt from predatory lenders. But the equipment never existed. A collective horrified murmur rippled through the audience. The rural community guests leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes locked on the projected evidence. Trevor is operating a textbook Ponzi scheme, I continued, my tone completely devoid of emotion. He fabricated hundreds of tractor serial numbers to secure new commercial loans. He then used the cash from those new loans to pay the minimum monthly balances on his older, defaulting credit lines. When regional banking inspectors requested physical audits of his inventory, he temporarily leased equipment from neighboring counties for a single day, swapping the license plates and presenting the rented machinery as his own proprietary assets. The ledgers never balanced. He has generated zero legitimate revenue since the inception of his company. The wealthy farmers and agribusiness owners in the audience exchanged sharp, disgusted glances. In the rugged, unforgiving environment of North Dakota, stealing valor in the agricultural sector is considered a cardinal sin. Fabricating labor and faking crop yields violates the core principles of their close-knit community. Trevor was no longer just a failed businessman to them. He was a recognized predator. Because a Ponzi scheme requires a constant influx of massive capital to survive, Trevor began bleeding cash at an uncontrollable rate, I stated, pacing slowly across the edge of the platform. His creditors were preparing to audit his physical lots. He desperately needed an emergency financial lifeline to prevent total insolvency and federal imprisonment. He needed a massive cash injection, and he knew my pristine credit and my unyielding financial boundaries would never allow me to fund his fraud. I stopped pacing and locked my icy gaze directly onto my mother and father. So he bypassed me entirely, I said softly, letting the syllables hang heavy in the stale air. He went directly to the two people whose desperate need to project a flawless, wealthy image completely overshadowed their basic common sense. I pressed the wireless remote again. The spreadsheets detailing Trevor's fabricated fleet vanished. The screen was immediately filled with highly sensitive, digitized banking records, wire transfer receipts, and a stark, undeniable property deed. Gary let out a sharp, breathless gasp. His hands clamped down hard on the edge of the white tablecloth. His face, already a sickly shade of gray, suddenly drained of whatever remaining color it possessed. Diane covered her mouth with her trembling hands, her eyes bulging as she recognized the exact documents projected above her head. I explicitly warned my parents about Trevor's catastrophic financial instability 4 months ago. I informed the silent room, ensuring my voice remained clinically detached. I provided them with the preliminary data indicating his severe debt-to-equity ratio. I advised them to exercise extreme caution. Instead of heeding the professional advice of a senior forensic accountant, my mother called me a jealous, bitter spinster. My father accused me of trying to sabotage my sister's happiness because I was envious of her glamorous lifestyle. They deliberately chose to ignore the mathematics to protect their golden child's fragile illusion. I raised my hand, pointing directly at the digitized property deed displayed on the massive screens. That is the official deed to the Duncan family farm, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, unyielding finality. 4 generations of our ancestors poured their blood, sweat, and tears into that harsh Midwestern soil. My grandfather worked himself to the bone to ensure that land remained free and clear of any institutional debt. He entrusted that legacy to my father, expecting him to protect the agricultural foundation of our family. The entire venue was paralyzed by the gravity of the impending revelation. 2 weeks ago, my father secretly leveraged that entire multi-generational legacy I announced, delivering the ultimate devastating blow. Gary and Diane took out a massive, predatory second mortgage on the family farm. They completely bypassed the local credit unions, opting for a shadow lender who did not require extensive income verification. They withdrew the maximum allowable equity and quietly wired the entire sum directly into a shell company controlled entirely by Trevor. The converted barn erupted into a chaotic symphony of horrified gasps and furious hushed whispers. The elite rural community was absolutely appalled. These were men and women who possessed calloused hands, individuals who understood the profound, almost sacred value of ancestral farmland. To them, risking a century-old family farm to secretly fund a flashy suburban con artist was not merely a poor financial decision. It was an unforgivable moral failure. I watched the social execution of my parents happen in real time. The prominent agricultural executives sitting at the adjacent tables physically shifted their chairs away from Gary and Diane. The polite, superficial respect my parents had spent decades cultivating within the Bismarck Society completely evaporated. They were instantly transformed into undeniable pariahs. The community recognized them not as victims of a scam, but as reckless, toxic enablers who had willingly gambled their heritage on a lie. You handed a massive cash bailout to a man actively committing interstate wire fraud, I said, looking down at my father. You did not just make a foolish investment, Gary. By knowingly funneling money into a fraudulent corporate entity to hide phantom assets from federal banking inspectors, you actively participated in the concealment of a felony. You are an unindicted co-conspirator in a federal crime. Gary could not speak. The sheer, crushing magnitude of his monumental stupidity finally broke through his arrogant, patriarchal shell. He realized he had not just lost his money. He had lost his pristine reputation, his community standing, and the very land his grandfather had broken the sod to claim. He clutched his chest, his large hands gripping the fabric of his suit jacket as a sudden, sharp, physical panic seized his body. His breathing became incredibly ragged, his lungs struggling to pull air into his seizing chest. He slumped heavily against the table, his eyes wide and vacant, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that he had orchestrated his own total destruction. Diane jumped from her seat, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. Her artificial composure shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy guests who were now actively staring at her with unvarnished disgust. She realized the elite social circle she worshipped had permanently closed its doors to her. Desperation consumed her entirely. She turned her tear-streaked face back toward the elevated platform, her hands outstretched in a pathetic, trembling plea, preparing to launch a final, hysterical defense to save whatever fragile shards of her life remained. Diane raised her trembling hands, her mouth opening to launch a final, desperate plea for mercy, but the words died instantly in her throat. A piercing, high-pitched wail shattered the heavy silence of the converted timber barn. The sound originated from far down the county highway, slicing through the crisp North Dakota night with an undeniable, terrifying urgency. The distant scream of multiple sirens multiplied rapidly, echoing across the flat, unyielding plains. The cavalry had arrived. The ambient amber lighting of the venue was suddenly overwhelmed by harsh, strobing flashes of red and blue piercing through the large rustic windows. The frantic colors painted the stunned faces of the wealthy guests in sharp, alternating shadows. Ethan stood completely still beside the DJ stand, his posture radiating a calm, calculated dominance. He subtly nodded toward the main entrance. His private tactical security personnel, the unyielding men who had padlocked the heavy doors just minutes prior, moved with practiced military precision. They swiftly unlocked the iron chains and pulled the massive wooden doors wide open, stepping aside smoothly to clear a wide, unobstructed path. A formidable swarm of uniformed state troopers and plainclothes local detectives flooded into the reception hall. Their heavy boots struck the polished hardwood floor in unison, instantly transforming the luxurious wedding environment into an active, secured crime scene. The lead investigator, a seasoned man possessing sharp, uncompromising features and a demeanor entirely devoid of patience, swept his austere gaze across the expansive room. He did not ask who was in charge. He immediately identified the locus of control and strode purposefully toward the elevated bridal platform. I stepped down to meet him, moving with the cold, measured efficiency that defined my entire professional existence. I did not offer a hysterical explanation or a tearful, panicked victim narrative. Instead, I extended my hand, offering a thick, meticulously organized manila folder. Throughout my decade-long career as a senior forensic accountant, I had spent countless hours structuring federal compliance audits, presenting irrefutable, heavily indexed data to hostile corporate boards. This specific folder represented the absolute pinnacle of that rigorous discipline. I calmly informed the lead detective that the dossier contained the comprehensive digital footprint of a coordinated interstate wire fraud scheme. I instructed him to review the sworn, notarized affidavit provided by the undercover corporate investigator alongside the specific banking routing numbers mapping the illicit flow of funds directly into a fraudulent shell company. The detective accepted the heavy file, his rigid expression shifting from standard procedural caution to deep, respectful astonishment. I then pointed my index finger directly at the sweetheart table, instructing his forensic technician to immediately secure the tainted champagne flute. A gloved officer swiftly bagged the crystal glass, hermetically preserving the chemical evidence of my younger sister's attempted felony assault. Simultaneously, a dedicated team of emergency medical technicians rushed past the central dance floor, aggressively wheeling a heavy aluminum stretcher toward the collapsed form of my sibling. Ashley remained completely unresponsive, her body entirely limp and devoid of motor control under the crushing weight of the synthetic sedative she had maliciously intended for my consumption. The paramedics rapidly assessed her vital signs, shining harsh tactical flashlights directly into her unresponsive, dilated pupils. They lifted her dead weight onto the sterile medical gurney, snapping thick nylon restraints tightly across her expensive sequined designer dress to prevent her from sliding off the mattress. This moment manifested the ultimate, inescapable execution of poetic justice. Ashley had spent her entire adult life obsessively curating a pristine, flawless social media image. She lived exclusively for the superficial validation of online followers, constantly projecting a fabricated narrative of untouchable glamour and effortless beauty. She had spent 5 hours in a salon chair that very morning, ensuring her hair and makeup were camera-ready for the dozens of curated photographs she planned to post. Now, her head lolled awkwardly to the side, her carefully applied lipstick smeared across her cheek, and a thick, humiliating trail of saliva pooled visibly on the white medical pillow beneath her face. The EMTs briskly wheeled her toward the main exit, navigating through the parted sea of horrified onlookers. As the heavy barn doors swung open to accommodate the stretcher, a blinding barrage of camera flashes erupted from the darkness outside. Local news crews, alerted by the massive, unusual mobilization of county law enforcement on their police scanners, had aggressively swarmed the perimeter of the venue. They eagerly filmed the golden child's humiliating, comatose exit, their bright television lights illuminating every grotesque detail of her pharmacological collapse. Her carefully constructed societal facade was permanently destroyed, captured in high definition, and broadcast to the entire evening news audience across the state. Inside the barn, the lead detective turned his unwavering predatory attention back to the man sweating profusely in the wooden chair. Trevor attempted to stand, his mouth opening to launch another pathetic, fabricated defense, but the responding officers afforded him absolutely no grace. 2 burly state troopers grabbed him violently by the shoulders, spinning his expensive tailored suit around with brutal force. They slammed him face first against the nearest rough timber support pillar. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the silent room as they locked his wrists tightly behind his back, effectively neutralizing his physical mobility. The lead detective approached the restrained criminal standing mere inches from Trevor's ear. He read the Miranda rights, enunciating every single syllable with punishing, undeniable clarity. He ensured the wealthy, prominent members of the rural community witnessed the complete, unvarnished eradication of the fake millionaire who had tried to infiltrate their ranks. Trevor openly wept his tears soaking into the rough wood of the pillar, begging anyone to intervene. No one moved to help him. Just as the troopers prepared to haul the sobbing fraudster out to the waiting squad cars, the detective's sharp eyes caught a glint of light under the overhead bulbs. He reached out and grabbed Trevor's right arm, aggressively inspecting the massive, oversized gold watch strapped to the prisoner's wrist. Trevor had spent the entire evening incessantly rubbing that specific timepiece, utilizing it as a vulgar, superficial prop to project his imaginary debt-fueled wealth. The detective unclasped the heavy metal band, stripping it directly from Trevor's skin. He casually announced to the silent room that any high-value luxury items purchased with illicit stolen funds are subject to immediate confiscation under federal asset forfeiture laws. The gold watch dropped into a clear plastic evidence bag with a dull, satisfying thud. The ultimate symbol of Trevor's arrogant deception was reduced to a tagged item in a police precinct property locker. Trevor was dragged away kicking and screaming obscenities, completely stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and his stolen assets. The immediate physical threat posed by the fraudulent couple had been ruthlessly neutralized, but the underlying rot that had funded their enterprise remained seated in the front row. The detectives pivoted sharply, their austere gazes locking directly onto the primary family table. My parents watched the uniformed officers approach, the terrifying realization finally dawning on their pale faces. By actively funding the fraudulent Ponzi scheme through their reckless second mortgage, they were no longer just humiliated passive bystanders. They were active suspects in a massive financial conspiracy, and their ruthless interrogation was about to begin. The heavy timber doors swung shut, sealing the crisp night air outside and trapping the stifling tension inside the reception hall. The flashing red and blue lights of the departing police cruisers painted violent streaks across the high wooden rafters, fading slowly into the distance as they transported my sister and her fraudulent fiancé away from the venue. The profound silence that followed was absolute. 150 affluent guests remained frozen in their seats, processing the brutal efficiency of the corporate and legal demolition they had just witnessed. They were prominent members of a rugged agricultural community, individuals who built their fortunes through decades of grueling labor and unyielding discipline. They stared at the primary family table with naked judgment. In the center of that devastating scrutiny stood my father. Gary was a man who had spent his entire adulthood measuring his personal worth by the exact acreage he controlled and the absolute fear he instilled within his own household. He had ruled our dining room table like a petty tyrant, constantly demanding unwavering obedience, while deliberately treating my forensic accounting career as a useless, insignificant hobby. He always viewed my independence as a direct threat to his patriarchal authority. For 32 years, he had operated under the arrogant delusion that he was the smartest person in any room. Now that delusion lay shattered across the hardwood floor, broken by the very daughter he had continuously dismissed. The staggering reality of his financial exposure finally crashed through his stubborn cognitive dissonance. Ethan had publicly triggered the acceleration clause on the massive debt fueling the phony agricultural equipment startup. Because my father had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on our ancestral farm to fund that exact shell company, his own financial survival was inextricably tethered to a sinking ship. He was completely exposed to the catastrophic blast radius of the margin call. Gary looked around the room, searching the faces of his longtime friends and wealthy neighbors for a single shred of sympathy. He found absolutely nothing but averted eyes and cold shoulders. Stripped of his blustering pride and his false societal standing, the tyrant rapidly dissolved into a beggar. Gary stumbled forward, his expensive dress shoes dragging heavily against the polished oak floorboards. His broad shoulders slouched, and his face appeared suddenly haggard, adding a decade of age to his features in a matter of minutes. He approached the space where Ethan and I stood. He did not puff out his chest or issue a booming command. Instead, he reached out with a trembling, calloused hand and aggressively grabbed my fingers. His palm was slick with cold sweat, his grip radiating a pathetic, vibrating desperation that made my stomach turn. "Katie, please!" Gary gasped, his voice cracking into a ragged, high-pitched wheeze that barely resembled his normal speech. "You have to stop this, right now! You have to talk to your husband! Ethan is a businessman, and business is just about numbers. We can fix this math. We can make a deal." He squeezed my hand tighter, leaning in close as if trying to shield his humiliating plea from the audience of rural elites watching his every move. "I need you to sign over the Badlands acreage," he begged, his eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute terror. "You can transfer the mineral rights directly to Coal Energy tonight. 500 acres of prime oil territory will more than satisfy the $4 million margin call. If you give Ethan the land, he can release the lien on the startup and cancel the debt. It will save the family farm, Katie. You cannot let the bank take the land your great-grandfather settled. You are my daughter. You have to save our home." His proposal was a masterpiece of lifelong entitlement. Even in the exact moment of his total ruin, Gary still fundamentally believed he held the right to harvest my assets to cover his monumental mistakes. He expected me to sacrifice the sole inheritance left to me by a man who actually valued my intelligence just to rescue him from a felony he committed for my sister. I looked down at his trembling hand wrapped tightly around my fingers. I did not feel a single ounce of filial obligation. The biological imperative to seek his approval had been permanently eradicated the moment he tried to force my signature in the bridal suite. I took a deliberate, forceful step backward. I yanked my hand out of his sweaty grasp, physically severing the emotional bond that had chained me to his toxicity for my entire life. "I am not giving you my land, Gary," I stated, my voice projecting with a calm, surgical precision that echoed throughout the silent venue. "And even if I possessed the desire to rescue you from your own staggering stupidity, the transaction you are demanding is legally impossible." I watched his face contort in confusion, giving him exactly 3 seconds to process my rejection before delivering the fatal blow. "My grandfather was a remarkably astute man," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly even. "He understood exactly who you were. He knew your greed would eventually bankrupt the family farm, and he explicitly warned me to keep the Badlands acreage entirely out of your reach. I took his warning very seriously. You cannot seize my property to satisfy your debt, because I no longer hold the direct title to that real estate." Gary froze, his jaw dropping slightly as the implications of my words began to form in his panicked mind. "What are you talking about?" he choked out, stepping forward again but keeping his hands to himself. "Where is the deed?" 30 days ago, I executed a highly complex legal maneuver I explained, delivering the facts with the sterile detachment of a corporate audit. I transferred the complete ownership of all 500 acres into a blind, irrevocable trust. That trust is exclusively managed and heavily fortified by the Wealth Management Division of Coal Energy. Once an asset is placed inside an irrevocable trust, the transfer is entirely permanent. The property cannot be sold, it cannot be leveraged for collateral, and it absolutely cannot be transferred to cover a margin call. I cannot access the principal, and you certainly cannot touch the mineral rights. The asset is permanently untouchable. The color drained completely from Gary's face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent white. He staggered backward as if I had physically struck him in the chest. The magical bailout he had conjured in his desperate mind evaporated into thin air. He realized the vast fortune he had planned to steal was locked behind a multi-billion-dollar corporate fortress entirely shielded from his grasping hands. But the devastation of his financial landscape was still not fully mapped. He still harbored the microscopic hope that he could simply default on the second mortgage and slowly negotiate a repayment plan with his local bank. It was time to eradicate that final, pathetic delusion. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding the severity of your current position," I said, taking a step closer to ensure he heard every single syllable clearly. "You did not just make a poor investment, Gary. You secretly mortgaged your ancestral property and wired the proceeds directly into a fraudulent shell company to hide phantom assets from federal inspectors. You actively funded an interstate wire fraud scheme." I paused, letting the word fraud hang in the heavy air. "The modern banking system is governed by highly sophisticated automated compliance algorithms," I continued. "These systems are specifically designed to detect and quarantine illicit funds instantly. When Ethan publicly exposed the fabricated serial numbers and triggered the acceleration clause tonight, The corporate intelligence team simultaneously uploaded the verified financial evidence to the regional banking regulators. The rural executives in the audience nodded in grim understanding, fully aware of the ruthless speed of federal banking compliance. The moment the fraud was officially reported, the automated algorithms at your local bank flagged your second mortgage for extreme breach of covenant. I stated firmly. Standard negotiation periods do not apply when the collateral is tied to a federal crime. The bank has already initiated the maximum penalty protocols to protect their institutional liability. They have officially called your loan. No, Gary whispered, shaking his head violently from side to side. No, they have to give me 30 days. They have to send a notice. They do not owe you a single day of grace when you commit a felony. I corrected him, my voice ringing with undeniable finality. The automated system has already flagged your property for immediate foreclosure. The legal notices are currently sitting in your email inbox. The bank will seize the farm by the end of the week to mitigate their exposure. You gambled 4 generations of hard-earned heritage to buy a fake millionaire a lifted truck, and you lost absolutely everything. Gary stared blankly at the floorboards, his mind completely shattering under the crushing, irreversible weight of his actions. He was a man who defined himself by the land he owned, and I had just handed him the absolute certainty of his impending homelessness. There was no secret account to drain. There was no daughter left to manipulate. There was absolutely no bailout coming. He stood in the center of the reception hall, a completely broken, destitute man, realizing he had legally and permanently orchestrated his own total destruction. As my father crumbled into a pathetic shell of his former self, the sudden sharp sound of heels clicking furiously against the hardwood floor announced a new, incredibly hostile presence rapidly approaching my flank. My mother, having watched her husband's complete subjugation, was preparing to launch a final hysterical offensive, refusing to accept that her carefully curated world was permanently dead. As my father completely crumbled into a pathetic, hollow shell of his former self, the sharp, frantic sound of heels clicking furiously against the polished hardwood floor announced a new, incredibly hostile presence rapidly approaching my flank. My mother, having just witnessed her husband's absolute subjugation, was preparing to launch a final, hysterical offensive. She adamantly refused to accept that her meticulously curated world was permanently dead. For 32 years, Diane had operated as the ultimate social architect of our family. She had dedicated her entire existence to projecting the flawless image of a prosperous, untouchable Midwestern matriarch. She hosted prestigious charity luncheons, smiled radiantly for local agricultural magazines, and aggressively hid our family's mounting financial rot behind expensive floral arrangements and tailored clothing. To Diane, optics were far more important than actual reality. I was always the inconvenient, boring workhorse required to maintain the machinery in the background, while my sister served as the radiant golden centerpiece of her grand societal performance. Now her prized centerpiece was strapped to a medical gurney, heading toward a county jail cell, and her husband was entirely bankrupt. Diane shoved her way past a cluster of stunned guests, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The artificial cloying sweetness she normally deployed for her country club friends had entirely evaporated, leaving behind the vicious, venomous core I had endured since childhood. She stopped mere inches from my face, her chest heaving, as she pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are an absolute monster," Diane screamed, her voice cracking and echoing painfully through the cavernous timber barn. "You deliberately ruined this entire wedding. You sent your own flesh and blood away in an ambulance, surrounded by police officers. You destroyed your sister's life on the most important day of her existence, just because you are a jealous, vindictive sociopath. I did not flinch. I did not take a step backward, nor did I raise my voice to match her frantic, escalating hysteria. The physical and emotional proximity of my mother used to trigger a deep biological anxiety within me, a desperate childhood conditioning to seek her elusive approval. That conditioning was now entirely extinct. I looked at the screaming woman standing before me and felt nothing but a profound, freezing detachment. I possessed the unyielding, quiet power of the silent Titan, a force that requires absolutely no screaming to assert its dominance. True authority relies exclusively on irrefutable facts. "I am not a monster, Diane," I replied, my voice projecting with a steady, surgical calm that sliced effortlessly through her chaotic outburst. "I am simply an accountant. I did not drive to a shadowy neighborhood to purchase a heavy synthetic narcotic. I did not discreetly slip a lethal dose of powder into a crystal champagne flute. I did not draft a fraudulent quitclaim deed attempting to steal 500 acres of prime real estate. I did not forge heavy machinery serial numbers to artificially inflate a corporate portfolio. And I certainly did not secretly leverage a generational family farm to fund an interstate wire fraud conspiracy." I paused, allowing the severe, undeniable weight of those listed felonies to settle over the audience of horrified onlookers. "You are attempting to assign the blame for a catastrophic explosion onto the person who merely pointed out the bomb." I continued my gaze, locking onto her terrified eyes. "I did not ruin this wedding. Your golden child and her fraudulent partner orchestrated their own spectacular demise. I merely refused to intervene. I stepped aside and allowed their criminal equations to reach their natural mathematical conclusion. The math simply balanced itself." Diane shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy, erratic strands across her tear-streaked face. "You could have stopped this privately," she wailed, attempting to pivot her emotional manipulation to a new angle. "If you knew about the business loans, you could have come to us quietly. We could have fixed the ledgers. We could have handled the situation as a family behind closed doors. You waited until tonight to publicly execute us, just to inflict the maximum amount of humiliation. You wanted to watch us suffer in front of our friends." Her desperate accusation provided the perfect opening to deploy the final terminal bureaucratic weapon I had kept securely holstered. I offered a cold, humorless smile, preparing to completely obliterate her remaining perception of the timeline. "You fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of federal regulatory compliance," I stated, my tone dropping to a low, commanding register. "As a senior forensic agribusiness accountant, I have a strict legal and ethical obligation to report severe financial irregularities. I did not wait until tonight to initiate your destruction. The trap was permanently locked long before you even mailed the wedding invitations." Exactly 7 days ago, I sat in my corporate office and compiled a highly detailed dossier regarding the fabricated tractor identification numbers and the suspicious flow of capital originating from your second mortgage, I revealed, watching the confusion slowly curdle into fresh terror on my mother's face. I submitted that comprehensive data packet directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I filed a formal suspicious activity report, heavily documenting the ongoing Ponzi scheme and highlighting the associated shell companies. Once a federal report of that magnitude is officially submitted by a credentialed forensic auditor, the process becomes entirely irreversible. The federal machine was already marching toward Bismarck to dismantle Trevor's operation before Ashley even poured the powder into my glass. I explained, delivering the absolute crushing reality of their situation. The agents at the Department of Justice were actively preparing the subpoenas and freezing the commercial accounts while you were busy complaining to the caterers this afternoon. The pathetic, sloppy attempt to drug me and steal my land tonight was just a redundant, desperate footnote to a tragedy that was already written. The authorities were coming to destroy your fake empire regardless of what happened at this reception. I simply expedited the timeline by handing the detectives the physical evidence when they arrived. The audience watched in complete, reverent awe as I systematically dismantled every single avenue of emotional manipulation my mother attempted. The affluent guests, the pillars of the North Dakota agricultural community, absorbed the full magnitude of the deception. Bismarck is a region built on grueling winters, resilient labor, and mutual unspoken trust. The people in this room operated multi-million-dollar cooperatives based on simple handshake agreements. They despised frauds, and they possessed absolutely zero tolerance for individuals who weaponized familial bonds to commit federal crimes. Diane turned away from me, frantically searching the faces of her longtime country club friends and fellow charity board members, desperately seeking a single sympathetic glance. She looked toward the wives of the prominent oil executives, women she had spent decades actively courting and impressing with her manufactured wealth. She expected them to rush forward to comfort her and to validate her victimhood. Instead, she encountered a solid wall of unvarnished disgust. The prominent guests did not offer a word of consolation. With a chilling synchronized finality, the most influential members of the rural elite physically turned their backs on my mother. It was the ultimate, inescapable, social excommunication. Diane was instantly rendered a ghost within her own community. Her entire identity, predicated entirely upon the superficial validation of her peers, evaporated into the cold, stale air of the venue. She stood, trembling, in the center of the room, completely alienated, a ruined matriarch with no empire left to govern. She slowly sank to the floor, her expensive gown pooling around her, weeping into her hands, as the absolute totality of her isolation finally took hold. I did not offer a hand to help her up. I did not provide a single word of parting comfort. I had successfully audited the toxic liabilities of my past, and the books were finally closed. I turned my back on my weeping parents, leaving them completely alone in the center of the sprawling dance floor. As Ethan and I stepped away from the shattered remnants of my family, the immediate atmosphere in the room shifted once more. The horrified guests, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the impending federal investigation, began to urgently murmur among themselves, signaling a chaotic impending exodus toward the exit doors. The reception dissolved with the terrifying, chaotic speed of a collapsing building. The remaining guests did not merely decide to leave the venue. They actively fled the perimeter. In the affluent, highly insulated agricultural circles of North Dakota, proximity to a federal financial crime is considered radioactive. The prominent oil executives, local politicians, and wealthy farm owners understood the severe legal implications of lingering at an active crime scene. Nobody wanted their name recorded in a police report detailing interstate wire fraud and felony assault. The wealthy socialites, who had spent the entire evening sipping expensive champagne and exchanging polite pleasantries, abandoned their half-full glasses on the rustic wooden tables. They aggressively pushed past one another, desperate to retrieve their coats and escape the blast radius of the massive scandal I had just detonated. I stood near the main exit watching the frantic exodus of the rural elite. These were individuals who guarded their public reputations with absolute, unyielding ferocity. A century of generational wealth in Bismarck is built on trust, firm handshakes, and pristine public standing. Witnessing my parents actively fund a fraudulent enterprise completely shattered that trust. The attendees refused to make eye contact with my mother or father as they sprinted toward the doors. The collective rejection was absolute, cementing the permanent social execution of my toxic family. Ethan stepped smoothly to my side, his presence a grounding, immovable force amidst the swirling panic of the departing crowd. He did not say a word. He simply draped my tailored charcoal wool coat over my shoulders, protecting me from the biting chill of the autumn wind that swept through the open barn doors. His gesture was incredibly gentle, providing a stark, magnificent contrast to the terrifying corporate ruthlessness he had just deployed to destroy my sister's fiancé. We walked together out onto the expansive wooden patio, observing the terrified guests flood into the massive gravel parking lot. The ambient sounds of the disrupted wedding reception were suddenly entirely overwhelmed by a new, incredibly aggressive noise. The deep, guttural roar of heavy diesel engines violently shattered the quiet night air. The frantic guests froze in their tracks, turning their heads toward the entrance of the property. Driving straight up the main access road, flanked by the flashing amber lights of escort vehicles, was a convoy of massive industrial tow trucks. The heavy-duty recovery vehicles bore the sleek, unmistakable corporate insignia of Coal Energy and Logistics on their reinforced steel doors. Ethan had not merely triggered a digital margin call. He had orchestrated a flawless, synchronized physical asset seizure to coincide perfectly with the public humiliation. The logistics team bypassed the fleeing guests, maneuvering the massive tow trucks with surgical precision directly toward the VIP parking section. Sitting prominently in the very first row were the two towering, heavily modified luxury trucks Trevor had continuously boasted about during the rehearsal dinner. He had financed those exact vehicles using the fraudulent commercial credit line Ethan now legally controlled. The recovery operators leapt from their cabs, moving with rapid, uncompromising efficiency. They ignored the wealthy onlookers entirely, dragging heavy steel chains and hydraulic lifts toward the pristine, lifted trucks. The loud, metallic clanking of thick iron hooks wrapping around the vehicle axles echoed across the freezing plains. It was the ultimate, undeniable payoff. The guests stood paralyzed in the frigid air, their breath pluming in the harsh work lights of the tow trucks, watching the physical manifestation of Trevor's fake wealth being violently stripped away. Trevor had spent months utilizing those specific vehicles to project an illusion of overwhelming success. He had paraded them around town, weaponizing his fabricated financial status to intimidate local contractors and impress my shallow, image-obsessed sister. Now his prized possessions were hoisted unceremoniously into the air, their alarm systems blaring uselessly into the night as they were dragged onto the flatbeds. The public repossession served as a final, inescapable confirmation for every single person in attendance. The agricultural technology startup was definitively dead. The fortune was a complete mirage. I turned my head to look back through the wide open doors of the converted timber barn. The visual juxtaposition was absolutely breathtaking. The interior of the venue was a masterpiece of rustic luxury, adorned with cascading floral arrangements, thousands of glittering string lights, and tables draped in imported white linen. Yet, positioned directly in the center of that magnificent, expensive beauty, sat my mother and father. They were completely, utterly alone. The vast room had been entirely evacuated. Not a single friend, relative, or business associate remained to offer them comfort. Gary sat heavily in his chair, his broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, staring blankly at the floorboards where his golden child had collapsed just an hour prior. Diane remained on the ground, shivering uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands as the finality of their isolation crushed the remaining breath from her lungs. They were waiting, in the deafening silence, for the plainclothes detectives to re-enter the room and begin their formal, unyielding interrogations regarding their complicity in the wire fraud scheme. They had sacrificed their entire, multi-generational legacy to maintain a hollow facade. They had willingly offered my financial future to a criminal just to ensure their favorite daughter possessed a mansion she did not earn. Now they were left with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of their own homelessness and the terrifying prospect of federal indictments. The kingdom they had ruled with such toxic, demanding authority had been leveled to the ground. Ethan caught my eye. We shared a quiet, rehearsed look that conveyed volumes without requiring a single spoken syllable. We did not merely survive a hostile ambush designed to steal my inheritance. We had executed a flawless, systematic corporate and familial cleanup. The precision of the counterattack was absolute. The parasitic infection that had plagued my entire adult life, constantly demanding my resources while actively mocking my profession, had been permanently and ruthlessly excised. I pulled the collar of my wool coat tighter against the North Dakota wind. I felt an incredible, intoxicating surge of pure liberation. The heavy, suffocating chains of familial obligation were legally and emotionally severed. The trap had snapped shut, with perfect mathematical precision catching the predators entirely off guard and leaving them to rot in the cage of their own making. I turned my back on the illuminated barn and the ruined figures huddled inside. I walked alongside my husband toward our waiting vehicle, leaving the wreckage of my past securely in the rearview mirror. I watched as the heavy hydraulic winches engaged, pulling Trevor's prized luxury vehicles firmly onto the reinforced steel beds of the recovery trucks. The loud mechanical grinding served as a fitting soundtrack to the evening's conclusion. Throughout my childhood, my father had constantly lectured me on the value of hard work, utilizing his ownership of the ancestral farm to demand absolute compliance from everyone in his orbit. He wielded his property as a blunt weapon, threatening to disinherit anyone who questioned his authority. He had proudly claimed that true power was derived from the soil you controlled. Now, the ultimate irony was fully realized. He had lost his cherished soil because he lacked the fundamental intelligence to understand the modern financial world. He had foolishly attempted to outsmart a senior forensic auditor and a private equity billionaire using amateur forgery and stolen bank routing numbers. The flashing amber lights of the tow trucks cast long, erratic shadows across the gravel parking lot. The remaining stragglers among the affluent crowd quickly ushered their spouses into their high-end SUVs, speeding away into the dark night. They wanted absolutely no part in the impending investigations. They knew that when federal authorities audit a fraudulent enterprise, they subpoena every single associate connected to the primary suspect. Gary and Diane were now highly toxic liabilities. The local country club would quietly revoke their memberships by Monday morning. The agricultural supply stores would immediately freeze their credit accounts. Their social execution was complete, instantaneous, and entirely irreversible. Ethan placed his hand gently on the small of my back, guiding me away from the chaos and toward our armored vehicle waiting at the edge of the property. The contrast between his warmth and the freezing reality he had just inflicted upon my abusers was staggering. He was a man who commanded global supply chains, yet he had spent months quietly enduring their pathetic insults, patiently waiting for the precise moment to unleash his formidable power. He had respected my autonomy, allowing me to take the lead during the confrontation, stepping in only to deliver the final, crushing corporate blow. This was the true essence of our partnership, We operated as a unified, impenetrable front. As I settled into the luxurious leather seat of our car, I looked out the tinted window one last time. The heavy timber barn, previously a symbol of my impending marital joy, now stood as a silent tomb for my parents' ruined ambitions. The state troopers were currently cordoning off the main entrance with bright yellow police tape, officially transforming the wedding venue into an active federal crime scene. The parasitic elements of my bloodline had been permanently neutralized. The cold, relentless machinery of justice had been successfully activated. We drove away from the property, the smooth acceleration of the engine carrying us toward the safety of our home. The dramatic events of the evening had concluded, but the catastrophic legal fallout was already looming on the horizon, promising a rapid, merciless resolution to their monumental crimes. Exactly 72 hours later, the relentless, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system had fully processed the wreckage of my former family. The chaotic explosion I had orchestrated at the wedding reception had rapidly settled into a cold, permanent reality of severe legal consequences. The transition from affluent arrogance to absolute destitution occurred with breathtaking speed. Trevor stood before a federal magistrate in a sterile, windowless courtroom, entirely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his obnoxious designer accessories. He wore a standard-issue bright orange county jail jumpsuit, his wrists securely fastened to a thick leather transport belt that severely restricted his movements. The high-priced defense attorney his parents had frantically scraped together attempted to argue for pretrial release, claiming Trevor was a respected local entrepreneur with deep ties to the agricultural community. The federal prosecutor did not even bother to raise his voice in rebuttal. He simply slid a massive, heavy binder across the polished wooden table directly toward the judge. That binder contained the decrypted email logs, the forged notary stamps, the fabricated equipment serial numbers, and the comprehensive financial audit Ethan and I had handed over to the detectives. The magistrate reviewed the documents for exactly 3 minutes before making a final, unyielding decision. Citing the overwhelming, irrefutable digital evidence, the sheer magnitude of the interstate wire fraud scheme, and the distinct possibility that Trevor might attempt to access hidden offshore accounts, the judge officially deemed him a severe flight risk. Bail was aggressively and permanently denied. Trevor collapsed back into his wooden chair, burying his pale face in his trembling hands as the armed bailiffs prepared to escort him back to his concrete cell. He would sit in that suffocating enclosure for months, awaiting his formal federal arraignment. His imaginary agricultural technology empire was entirely dead, replaced by the grim, inescapable reality of a lengthy penitentiary sentence. Across town, the pharmacological fog finally lifted from my younger sister. Ashley blinked her eyes open, expecting to find herself lounging in a luxurious 5-star honeymoon suite, surrounded by imported flowers and expensive room service. Instead, her vision was immediately assaulted by the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the county medical center. She attempted to sit up, but quickly discovered a thick nylon medical restraint, keeping her firmly secured to the uncomfortable hospital bed. The moment the attending physician officially updated her medical chart, stating the synthetic sedative had fully metabolized out of her system, the heavy wooden door to her room swung wide open. 2 plainclothes detectives stepped inside, their expressions radiating absolute professional indifference. They did not bring her a bouquet of roses or offer a warm cup of coffee. They handed her a stack of freshly stamped legal documents. Ashley was immediately served with formal criminal charges for attempted felony assault and aggravated forgery. She frantically demanded her smartphone, desperate to log on to her social media accounts to spin a pathetic, victimized narrative for her thousands of followers. The lead detective coldly informed her that her mobile device had been confiscated as primary physical evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. Her meticulously curated digital kingdom was completely eradicated. She was no longer a glamorous, untouchable bride preparing for a lavish tropical vacation. She was a documented criminal suspect facing a mandatory minimum sentence, trapped in a sterile room under constant armed police guard, entirely abandoned by the man who had promised her the world. While the younger generation faced the brutal consequences of their arrogance behind bars, my parents experienced a completely different, yet equally devastating form of absolute destruction. The margin call Ethan had publicly triggered executed flawlessly, rolling through their financial landscape like an unstoppable avalanche. The banking institutions involved did not care about generational legacy, local pride, or the historical significance of the Duncan family farm. Modern banks operate exclusively on cold mathematics and strict risk mitigation. When the automated compliance algorithms confirmed that Gary and Diane had secretly funneled the proceeds of their second mortgage into a fraudulent shell company to hide phantom assets, the institutional response was instantaneous and merciless. For 4 generations, that expansive, fertile acreage had served as the bedrock of our family. My ancestors had broken the harsh Midwestern sod, surviving brutal winters and devastating droughts, to build a prosperous agricultural stronghold. My father had weaponized that exact legacy to demand absolute obedience, constantly reminding me that true power stemmed from the soil you controlled. He used the threat of disinheritance to keep me compliant, assuming my desire to preserve the farm would always override my professional ethics. Now, his staggering stupidity had surrendered that sacred soil directly to a team of corporate liquidators. The bank aggressively initiated hostile foreclosure proceedings, entirely bypassing the standard grace periods due to the underlying felony complicity. By Tuesday morning, a fleet of private foreclosure agents and county deputies arrived at the sprawling farmhouse. Gary and Diane were given exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. They frantically dialed the phone numbers of their longtime country club friends and fellow charity board members, begging for a temporary loan or a place to stay. Every single call went directly to voicemail. The affluent rural elite had witnessed their catastrophic public execution at the wedding reception and actively chosen to permanently excommunicate them. The prominent community members recognized them not as victims, but as toxic enablers who had willingly gambled their heritage on a criminal enterprise. Stripped entirely of their wealth, their pride, and their arrogant societal standing, my parents were forced to stuff their remaining clothing into cheap plastic garbage bags. They stood on the gravel driveway, shivering in the biting autumn wind, watching helplessly as the deputies placed heavy brass padlocks on the front doors of the only home they had ever known. Having lost their vehicles to aggressive repossession agents the previous day, they were forced to hire a discount moving van to transport their meager belongings. They drove away from the magnificent, sprawling farm and headed toward the extreme outskirts of Bismarck. Their new residence was a decaying, cramped, month-to-month rental apartment situated directly above a noisy commercial laundromat. The walls were paper-thin, the carpets were stained with years of neglect, and the suffocating scent of cheap bleach hung heavily in the stagnant air. The sprawling open skies they had enjoyed for decades were replaced by the depressing view of a cracked asphalt parking lot. The immense silence that settled between them in that tiny apartment was deafening, a constant, agonizing reminder of the absolute ruin they had willingly orchestrated. They had sacrificed their entire empire to coddle a manipulative daughter and a con artist, and now they were left with absolutely nothing to show for it but utter destitution. I monitored this entire legal and financial dismantling from the quiet sanctuary of my corporate corner office, situated on the top floor of a sleek glass high-rise in downtown Bismarck. My massive windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the rugged, beautiful Great Plains stretching out toward the horizon. I sat at my polished mahogany desk, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, meticulously reviewing the final audit reports sent by the legal team at Coal Energy. The high-resolution screen displayed the exact confirmation codes of the asset seizures, the finalized foreclosure documents, and the formal docket numbers for the impending federal trials. I looked at the digital paperwork and felt an incredible, profound sense of absolute liberation. There was no lingering guilt plaguing my conscience. There was no sorrow clouding my judgment. The biological imperative to mourn the destruction of my blood relatives had been completely eradicated by their own malicious actions. I had spent my entire life contorting myself to fit their toxic demands, constantly suppressing my intelligence to avoid threatening their fragile egos. I had endured their endless financial exploitation and their cruel, dismissive insults, always hoping they would eventually recognize my inherent value. But the ultimate truth of the universe is that mathematics never lies, and actions inevitably demand a balancing of the scales. They had actively planted the seeds of their own destruction, enthusiastically watering them with greed, arrogance, and a staggering lack of basic human decency. They believed they could orchestrate a felony physical assault to steal my inherited land without facing any repercussions. Now the harvest had arrived, and it was undeniably bitter. The narrative arc solidified its core, unbreakable theme. Toxic enablers will ultimately suffer the exact consequences they attempt to force upon others. And shared genetics do not provide a magical shield against the strict, unforgiving machinery of criminal law. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee, feeling entirely unburdened and profoundly peaceful. The parasitic infection was permanently gone, excised through ruthless clinical precision. The heavy, suffocating chains of the past were broken, leaving the future entirely mine to command. The heavy off-road tires of Ethan's unwashed pickup truck crushed the loose gravel beneath them, producing a steady, rhythmic, crunching sound that served as the only soundtrack to our drive. We had left the bustling corporate center of Bismarck far behind us, navigating the winding state highways that carved directly through the heart of the Great Plains. The transition from the steel and glass architecture of the city to the ancient, rugged expanse of the North Dakota Badlands was visually stunning. The topography shifted dramatically, trading flat, endless agricultural fields for towering, striated canyons and deep, plunging valleys, carved by centuries of wind and water. This was an environment that demanded absolute respect, a harsh and unforgiving landscape that easily crushed anyone who underestimated its sheer natural power. I sat in the passenger seat watching the breathtaking scenery roll past my window. The late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the jagged rock formations in brilliant, fiery shades of deep amber and bruised violet. I rested my hand gently on the center console, and Ethan instantly covered my fingers with his own. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. He did not need to speak a single word to convey his absolute, unwavering support. We operated on a frequency of mutual understanding that required no verbal validation. We had spent the last week surgically dismantling the toxic liabilities of my past, and now we were finally traveling to survey the foundation of our permanent future. Ethan steered the heavy truck off the main county road, turning onto a private unmarked dirt trail secured by a massive reinforced steel gate. He rolled down his window and entered a complex alphanumeric sequence into the encrypted keypad mounted on the metal post. The heavy gate swung open smoothly, granting us exclusive access to the perimeter of the property. This was the exact 500-acre tract of prime, oil-rich real estate that my grandfather had entrusted to my care. This was the precise asset my father had arrogantly attempted to hijack to save a fraudulent criminal, the very soil that my sister had believed she could steal by slipping a synthetic narcotic into my champagne flute. They had completely failed to understand that this land was never truly vulnerable. It was protected by an impenetrable legal fortress shielded by the multi-billion-dollar corporate architecture of coal energy. We drove for another 2 miles into the absolute heart of the acreage, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged and beautifully isolated. Ethan finally brought the truck to a gentle halt near the edge of a massive, sweeping ridge that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire property. He shifted the engine into park and turned the ignition off. The sudden silence that enveloped the cabin was profound and immaculate. It was not the tense, suffocating silence of a hostile family dinner, nor was it the terrified, desperate silence of a ruined wedding reception. It was the vast, expansive silence of total, unadulterated freedom. I pushed my car door open and stepped out onto the firm, cold earth. The biting, crisp autumn wind whipped instantly across the plateau, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed sagebrush and frozen dust. I was not wearing an expensive, fragile designer gown, and I was not balancing uncomfortably on imported stilettos. I wore a pair of heavily worn leather work boots, thick denim jeans, and a heavy insulated canvas jacket. Ethan stepped out of the driver's side wearing a faded flannel shirt and his trusted, battered denim coat. We looked exactly like a pair of standard working-class Midwestern farmhands. There were no flashy gold watches, no rented velvet dinner jackets, and no leased luxury vehicles to broadcast our status to the world. The visual irony was absolutely magnificent. The two people standing on that isolated ridge, dressed in the most practical, unassuming clothing imaginable, commanded a global financial empire. We were the apex predators of the regional economy, yet we possessed absolutely zero desire to flaunt our resources. We understood the fundamental truth that my family had tragically ignored for their entire lives. True wealth is completely silent. Authentic power does not require an audience. It does not demand social media validation, and it certainly does not need to belittle others to feel significant. Real power is holding the absolute ability to destroy your enemies and choosing to simply walk away into the quiet horizon. I walked toward the very edge of the ridge, my boots kicking up small clouds of dry dust. I looked out over the massive, sweeping expanse of the Badlands. Far in the distance, hidden seamlessly among the deep canyons, I could see the slow, methodical movement of heavy pumping units. They operated with a quiet, relentless efficiency, extracting highly valuable crude oil from deep within the subterranean reservoirs. Those pumps generated staggering amounts of legitimate, verified revenue every single day, quietly reinforcing the ironclad trusts that secured our generational wealth. I stared at the deep, ancient layers of rock and compacted soil, allowing my analytical mind to draw the final, undeniable comparison. The earth beneath my feet was unbreakable, unyielding, and completely immune to superficial manipulation. It stood in stark, glorious contrast to the cheap, fragile illusions my parents and my sister had desperately tried to construct. They had built a pathetic house of cards, using stolen identity documents, forged signatures, and predatory second mortgages. They had based their entire existence on the hollow pursuit of country club prestige and neighborhood envy. When the crushing weight of reality finally crashed down upon them, their fabricated empire dissolved into dust in a matter of seconds. Ethan walked up quietly behind me. I heard the steady crunch of his boots against the gravel just before I felt the heavy, comforting warmth of his arms wrapping securely around my shoulders. He pulled me back against his solid chest, shielding me entirely from the biting North Dakota wind. I leaned my full weight into his embrace, letting the tension that I had carried in my muscles for 32 years finally melt away completely into the freezing air. I rested my head against his shoulder, matching the steady, calming rhythm of his breathing. We stood together in absolute silence, watching the magnificent colors of the sunset slowly burn across the vast, uninterrupted sky. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, picturing the chaotic, burning wreckage we had left securely in our rearview mirror. My father and mother were currently sitting in a decaying, cramped rental apartment, entirely stripped of their pride, facing the terrifying reality of complete social excommunication and impending bankruptcy. My sister was trapped in a sterile hospital room, stripped of her digital kingdom, staring down the barrel of severe felony assault charges. Her fraudulent fiancé was locked inside a concrete county jail cell, permanently stripped of his professional licenses, and awaiting his federal arraignment for interstate wire fraud. They had collectively attempted to utilize my physical existence as a disposable stepping stone to elevate their own pathetic ambitions. They had arrogantly assumed that my quiet demeanor and my strict professional discipline were indicators of weakness. They had severely underestimated the terrifying, calculated wrath of a senior forensic auditor who decides to finally balance the familial ledgers. I had systematically audited the emotional and financial liabilities of my bloodline. I had identified the toxic assets, completely severed the parasitic credit lines, and ruthlessly liquidated their entire fraudulent enterprise. The accounts were permanently closed. The balance was finally zeroed out. I opened my eyes, letting the vast, stunning beauty of the Badlands fill my entire field of vision. The heavy, suffocating chains of familial obligation, the relentless demands for financial bailouts, and the constant, draining emotional manipulation were completely gone. I had surgically excised the infection from my life, and the resulting clarity was nothing short of miraculous. A profound, undeniable revelation settled permanently into my mind. I finally understood the core mathematical formula for true human security. Security is never derived from seeking the validation of broken, toxic people, even if those people happen to share your genetics. Security is built entirely on establishing firm, unbreakable boundaries and possessing the absolute courage to enforce those boundaries with catastrophic consequences when they are violated. The most brutal, devastating revenge you can ever inflict upon individuals who attempt to tear you down is not screaming in their faces or stooping to their pathetic level of petty drama. The ultimate revenge is achieving a state of absolute, untouchable success. It is building a towering, impenetrable fortress of legitimate wealth, genuine love, and pristine professional integrity, completely locking them outside the gates to starve in the barren wasteland of their own malicious creation. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp autumn air, feeling my lungs expand with the pure, unadulterated reality of my hard-earned peace. Ethan held me tighter against the approaching evening chill, our shared silence speaking volumes about the unbreakable foundation we had forged together. The sun finally dipped below the jagged edge of the canyon, casting the magnificent, unyielding North Dakota horizon into a deep, peaceful twilight. The shadows stretched long and dark across the fertile plains, covering the ancient landscape in a protective, silent embrace. I stood securely in the arms of the only man who had ever truly valued my mind, looking out over an empire that was entirely, legally, and permanently mine. The storm had finally passed, The toxic debris had been completely cleared away, and the vast, unburdened horizon stretching out before us was absolutely flawless. The vast, wind-swept expanse of the North Dakota Badlands is more than a geographical marvel. It is a testament to resilience and the harsh realities of nature. This rugged landscape mirrors the traditional American family, a structure built on the promise of foundational strength and generational legacy. Yet when we examine the self-inflicted collapse of the Duncan family, we are not merely witnessing a tale of corporate revenge. We are peering into an unvarnished mirror. We are witnessing the devastating harvest of a deeply flawed approach to parenting and the moral guidance of the next generation in American culture. At its core, the story of Katie Ashley and their parents is an exploration of what happens when family values are hollowed out by the desperate pursuit of optics and unearned status. It forces us to ask a deeply personal question. What are we actually building when we raise our children? And whose lives are we willing to destroy to protect the fragile illusions we have created for them? In contemporary American culture, there is an insidious pressure placed upon parents to ensure their children never experience discomfort or failure. Gary and Diane Duncan embody this toxic distortion of duty. They viewed Katie's independence and analytical mind not as virtues to be celebrated, but as expendable resources to be harvested. Conversely, they viewed Ashley's entitlement and obsession with superficial wealth as vulnerabilities requiring endless subsidization. This is the ultimate failure of fairness within the traditional family structure. True fairness does not mean ensuring every child has equal material wealth regardless of their character. It means holding every child to the same uncompromising standard of accountability. By shielding their golden child from the natural consequences of her malice, Gary and Diane did not protect Ashley. They fundamentally crippled her. They constructed a fragile glass house for her to live in and literally mortgaged their ancestral soil to pay for it. When parents abandon honesty in favor of enabling, they actively participate in their children's destruction. They teach them that rules are flexible and that familial love is a transactional currency. The overarching tragedy in the collapse of the Duncan Empire is the profound lack of emotional awareness that plagued the older generation. Traditional families thrive on unspoken bonds and mutual respect. However, Gary and Diane operated their household like a corrupt corporation. They lacked the emotional intelligence to recognize that Katie's quiet detachment was not a sign of coldness, but heavy armor forged against a lifetime of exploitation. Emotional awareness in parenting requires the courage to see your children as they truly are, not as extensions of your own ego. Gary tied his patriarchal identity to his absolute control over the family land and the manufactured facade his favorite daughter presented to the local elite. He lacked the emotional maturity to understand that true legacy is never found in the tractors you own or the square footage of your home. True legacy is found in the integrity, the grit, and the unyielding moral compass you instill in your children's hearts. Katie survived her family's insidious assassination attempt because she possessed the exact emotional awareness her parents utterly lacked. She understood that blood relation does not excuse toxicity. She recognized that the most profound form of self-respect is the willingness to walk away from those who demand you shrink yourself to fit their distorted narrative. We often teach children to honor their parents unconditionally, but we rarely teach parents that they must continuously earn that honor through honesty, fairness, and emotional consistency. What does it mean to be genuinely responsible for a family in the modern era? The American dream has long been intertwined with the noble idea of providing a better life for the next generation. But we have dangerously conflated a better life with an easier life. Family responsibility is not about clearing the path for your child. It is about meticulously preparing your child for the inevitable hardships of the path. When Gary and Diane secretly leveraged their family farm to fund a criminal wire fraud scheme, they convinced themselves they were fulfilling their parental duty. They believed that saving Ashley's fake millionaire lifestyle, even if it meant drugging and robbing their eldest daughter, was an act of profound loyalty. Instead, it was an act of supreme cowardice. They lacked the moral fortitude to look their favorite daughter in the eye and say the one word she desperately needed to hear: no. By completely failing to enforce boundaries, they transformed their home into a toxic incubator for arrogance. They weaponized their own resources against their responsible child to blindly subsidize the criminality of their irresponsible one. When blind loyalty is prioritized over objective morality, the family ceases to be a sanctuary and mutates into a criminal syndicate. Stories like the devastating implosion of the Duncan family are not mere cinematic fables. They are playing out in quiet suburbs and sprawling rural plains across the country every single day. They hold up a mirror to the darkest corners of our own living rooms. If these deep explorations of family dynamics, hidden truths, and the explosive consequences of toxic enabling resonate with you, I invite you to follow Emily Told Stories. Join our growing community as we continue to unravel breathtaking narratives that challenge our understanding of loyalty, justice, and the incredibly complex human condition. As we look at the quiet, unyielding horizon where Katie and Ethan finally found their hard-earned peace, we are left to deeply ponder the smoking ruins of the family they left behind. We are conditioned by society and generations of traditional American culture to believe that family is an unbreakable sacred bond. We are taught that the ultimate parental tragedy is witnessing a child's ruin, and that a parent's love must be an endless, unconditional safety net, ready to catch them no matter how far they fall. But perhaps this is the greatest, most destructive lie we tell ourselves. We are told that the ultimate parental failure is a child's downfall. But the truth is far more unnerving, striking at the very heart of what it means to truly love someone. The ultimate parental failure is not watching your child fall. It is the deliberate creation of a child who requires the ruin and subjugation of others just to survive. Conventional wisdom demands that we always catch our children, assuming that love is inherently synonymous with rescue. Yet if we are truly honest with ourselves, the highest, most profound form of love is not endless protection. Sometimes, true love is the agonizing, terrifying decision to completely remove the safety net. Because sometimes, the only way to honor your moral responsibility to the universe is to stop being a parent, step aside, and allow the brutal, magnificent machinery of consequence to finally do its job.